Okay, hi everybody. Um, Good to be together again. Thanks for folks who are returning and welcome new folks. So we've been doing these roughly monthly on a range of topics that somehow inform the experience of either dealing with illness or disability or loving someone who is. And this time we are going to jump into the splashy subject of sexuality. Um, a subject that is huge, profound, and it was one of the more striking examples of what gets short shrift in the medical setting. So let's see if we can kind of make up some of that slack. So as ever, today I'm just going to start us off with a handful of slides just to sort of level set and get us in the arena together. Again, these aren't meant to be comprehensive. This is a huge subject, but it should get us in the ballpark and thinking. And the best part of these things is when you guys start participating. So let me cut to this next slide here and hand it on over to Sonia real quick.
Thanks, BJ. Hey, everyone. Thanks for being with us. Just wanted to let you know the two ways that you can ask a question or comment on what comes up. You can raise your hand and we will unmute you and you can ask your question out loud. Or if you don't feel like speaking out loud to the group, you can type it in the question box and we will read it aloud for you. We realize that this topic is a little more maybe has a little more considerations than others. So if you really would like us to not use your name or be anonymous, that's totally fine. Please just let us know in the questions and we will make sure that we're not calling out your name along with it. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, Sonia. And on that note, guys, I guess especially for new folks, these sessions are meant to be, this is a private, sacred may sound wrong, but this is meant to be a place where we can all feel safe to share, think, and feel out loud and say things that may be hard to say other places. That's what their intention is. Of course, there's no pressure to do anything. But if you're feeling it, please do jump in. That's really where these things get most helpful, most interesting. So, okay. So with all that, let's move on here. So, one thing to note, sexuality, is it something we take for granted? I mean, I don't know. We all have some version of it, I suppose, do we not? It seems primal. It seems part of the human experience, the animal experience, the living experience. But boy, is it intricate. And do we ever have each our own routes to it? It means different things to different people, etc. But it certainly gets at who we are in some deep place, some place that may not be obvious in our daily lives. Some folks have a profound sex life. It's a big part of their daily experience, but many of us may not see that. So it's private, it's personal, it's huge. And it's, my friend Karen Skanke, who we might hear from at some point later, she's done a lot of work in sex therapy, and she likes to point out that sex is, 90+% in the head. It's not just about the body parts. And as it goes in the head, our psychology, so who we are as people, what our roles are, our identity, our sense of self, all that comes up in the sexual plane in big, big ways. And so when we start mucking with who we are, when we change roles, for example, that can have impacts on our sexual lives, on who is attracted, what is attracted to us, and vice versa, etc. So this comes up a lot in our context of illness, caregiving, etc. That people are cast into new roles as the patient, or the spouse now may be the caregiver. These are not necessarily sexy words, and may really be something of a buzzkill. And so it's no shame it's no wonder as we kind of go through life with these sort of new identities, threats to our identity, it shows up in our sex lives. It's one of the most exquisitely sensitive places, so of course it shows up there. So here we are just naming this phenomenon. It's a very real phenomenon. What we can do about it, let's save that for conversation. Change bodies, of course, too. So it's not just our sense of self, this sort of inner narrative thing, but our bodies literally change, especially with illness, and aging in general. Just over time, period. We don't have to pathologize it at all. So our bodies change, and a lot of, especially the ideas of sexuality that we pick up in social in society through advertisements on billboards, etc. It's a very narrow definition of sexuality. It's a very narrow idea of what constitutes sexy. But suffice it to say that you won't find many folks who are dealing with chronic illness or disability in these sort of the big tableau of what's considered sexy out there, which is really a shame. It's very common. There's a lot to talk about this. I just want to note it here. But those of us who have been dealing with disability, it's gotten better. But I hear stories from my mother and others back in the day that are just remarkable. And I've seen it too, which is basically that doctors will often presume that as a disabled person or someone who's sick, that therefore, of course, you're not having sex. I mean, look at you, essentially. So it happens all the time. People don't ask in the history. Doctors don't ask about your sex life if you're disabled. They presume you don't have one. My mom, I hope I don't out you here, Mom. By the way, my parents are probably on here. Yes, we're talking about sex, and my parents are in here. But they would just glance over a pap smear because they just presumed as a younger woman that she wasn't sexually active, or they'd have gynecological tables, exam tables where she couldn't get in. So there's all sorts of ways that medically and societally we narrow this idea of what constitutes sexy, and we exclude a zillion people from that definition. And it's such a shame. We undermine each other this way all the time. But what we're left with, of course, is we may feel ashamed of our bodies as they change. They may, never mind what's going on externally, we may not feel sexy. It may have nothing to do with advertisements on TV. I just may not feel sexy if my body's in pain, if my body is sort of unappealing to me, it doesn't look like it used to or like I want it to. And so much of sex has to do with desire, etc. So this can't be, we can't talk about this slide enough. This is a big piece of the picture. And so both sides so far are demanding of us that we have as much more fluid, nimble idea of what constitutes sex or sexy or sexuality. So, and on that note, really, I mean, I think one of the keys here, this is a slide to sort of jolt us a little bit to make sure all of us stay in our body. It's so, sometimes we lead with our frontal lobes, our intellect, our knowledge, and we can leave our bodies behind that way. Sometimes because of changes in our bodies that we may not like we were just talking about, or others may not like. That's a way to dissociate from our bodies. But one way or another, we got to get back to this thing called the body. And yes, sexuality has a lot to do with mental and psychological and social issues, yes. But invariably, the sort of the final common pathway has something to do with our bodies. And boy, it's one thing, when I think about when times where I've had a lot of pain, my body is just screaming pain at me. The idea of sex or sexiness or anything pleasant to come for or out of my body just seems impossible. So it's really tricky. How does your body stay your friend, and how do you stay with your body even when it's sending you a lot of difficult signals? So it's not easy, but I would say it's imperative. It's really essential one way or another. And it often means revisiting our body, revisiting our relationships to our body. That, again, here the note would be that this needs to stay fluid, and we need to stay limber with our ideas of self, with our ideas of sexy, with our ideas of even what feels good. So yes, let's all find a way to get back into our bodies. It's a kind of another, yet another epidemic, a smoldering one that's been going on a while. Uncomfortable conversations, right? So especially in the context of illness, serious illness, blah, 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 there's going to be a medical overlay. So sometimes this slide might be pointing us to push us to have uncomfortable conversations with our clinicians, with our physician. It's a very reasonable answer, a question to ask. Is it safe for me to have sex? Let's get at we'll eventually circle back to what we mean when we say the word sex. But for now, let's say conventional sex, touching, intercourse, etc. Is that safe? If we have a gynecological cancer or prostate cancer or anything else going on with our bodies, or our immune systems are distracted. So it's a fair conversation, a fair question. Is it actually safe? So one way or another, we might benefit from asking our doctors a question about this. And just to say, as with so many things that we talk about here, you may be as uncomfortable as it may be for you. You're going to be bumping up into bumping up against people for whom it's even more uncomfortable. And here again, you, even though you're the patient per se or whatever, it's going to be on you largely to push this conversation. I wouldn't wait for your doctor to bring it up or your nurse to bring it up. If you're wondering, ask them. So again, we can circle to the mechanics of uncomfortable conversations, but for here, let's just say these are, sex in general, I think in some ways, is maybe some of this conversation will be similar. Like it's just inherently awkward. And especially when you throw disability and illness in the mix, it's just clunky and weird, and we don't know what to say and how to say it, and is that sexy? Around and around we go. So I would say, yes, we need to have uncomfortable conversations with our doctors, with our partners, with ourselves, dare to sort of look at ourselves, dare to ask ourselves, dare to answer our own questions. But I just say it's inherently clunky, it's inherently awkward. And I've gotten around to the point where I find awkward kind of sexy. I find awkward kind of hilarious. So awkward is no longer the thing to avoid, at least in my world. So I'd push each other, push you guys. If you are curious about your sex life, it likely means you need to talk about it with somebody, your partner, doctor, etc. Okay, move on real quick here. So, well, I kind of let this cat out of the bag a little bit here in my last comments, but there is this. I think sex in any way, it is. There are boundaries in there. There are lines to cross and not cross. Those folks who push their sex lives into sort of less conventional avenues. There's a need for a safe word, for example. Like, is this too much? Are we going too far? Sex and safety have a really interesting relationship. And on one hand, we need to feel safe to even open up the thought of the conversation or feel like we can get naked. I mean, literally and figuratively. Safety is a really important piece of that puzzle. Sex, like play and other things, flows from that safety. Sometimes the lack of safety can be a turn on, so sometimes playing with the boundaries of safety is erotic or at least exciting. So it's not just simply say, oh, well, find a safe place and get comfortable and go there and great sex will flow from that. Well, not so. That's much more interesting and intricate than that. But it's highly personal. So I'd push each of us to find this interplay between comfort and discomfort, safety and, sort of challenge, let's say. There's something in the lines between these things that I think is very charged and can be very powerful. But each to our own for this one, all right? Being alone, we probably don't do this enough, guys. In our conversations, we presume that each of us has somebody in our lives, or we presume that there's someone, a caregiver, someone caring for us, or it's, so much of the well-intended conversations imply that everybody has somebody. But of course we don't. A lot of us are alone, and even those of us who have somebody might often feel alone. So we have to give this some due. There is a piece of this puzzle, and one of the things that may be getting in the way of returning or finding a new sex life or extending your sex life may simply be finding someone with whom to do it. So I don't want to underestimate this one. It's a big one. Loneliness is a big thing out there for many of us. Again, even those of us who are partnered up. So just to note it, but I would also suggest that just because if you're alone, just because you're alone, doesn't mean you have no access to a sex life. I mean, sure, there's the internet and all that goes with that, and the pornography world and chat rooms and the sex positive stuff out there too online. There are ways to find your community online. That may not be very satisfying for some folks, but they're out there. I'd push you to at least look. But there's also, I think it's possible to have some sex life by yourself. Of course, the obvious thing would be masturbation. But this isn't just about the sex act. It's about feeling in your body. It's about feeling sexy. It's about feeling that creative energy that goes with this primal act, this primal thing. You may not really need any words for it, but it is certainly one way in which we feel alive. And there's a lot to explore even by yourself. So I wouldn't give up on the idea of a sex life if you're alone. So yeah, so connection, you know, so talk about this, let's open this idea up a little bit about what the heck sex is. So sex is not just intercourse. Let's start with the basics. That's one way, but just about anything can be erogenous, can be sexy. I mean, maybe a good definition of sex is something that the way most of us mean it is an aesthetic pursuit. And yes, aesthetic in that it comes through the senses, but also aesthetic in that it has its own power. It exists for its own sake. You might say sex is certainly intercourse, maybe for procreation purposes. Though some of you may feel that way, that's okay. But even when it's a means to an end, there's still something pretty majestic about the act itself. And it seems to have a power all its own, for its own sake. So even if we're not reproducing, there's something in this for its own sake. It's a way of being alive in its own way. So that does not, again, that's not just a matter of penetration. That's not a matter of just men and women together, of course. This can be, we can define this for ourselves, what constitutes sex. Just about anything could constitute sex, as far as I can tell. I mean, as far as I've seen now in the world, it's not just an idea. It might be interesting if our conversation chips into fetish, how that plays in here. What the heck is fetish? I'm not sure I know the answer, but anyway, we can go there. But all to say where I'm heading here in this commentary is that underneath all that, whatever all that is, I think much of the power of sex is this primal connection. Okay. And it's important to name that because even when sex is out of reach, no matter how much we try or how inventive we get, there may be times where sex, the idea of it is largely out of reach for us, or maybe we just not want it. Reminds me of a story that when researching our book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, we came upon a story about a man in the VA, and he and his wife were in therapy, and that he could no longer have sex anymore in the classical way. He could no longer get an erection, and he was terribly ashamed of all this, and he was acting out, and finally they were in the therapy together in the couple, and he sort of opened this up and let out that he could no longer have sex and felt terrible about it and just felt terrible about it. And the therapist turned to the wife, and the wife said, I know that frankly, it was a relief at this stage in the relationship. That wasn't really what she was interested in anyway. It was a relief to let go of that notion of sex and open up other notions of intimacy. So just to say, there's all sorts of a world waiting for us beyond conventional sex. And underneath it, I think what we're all yearning for is this connection. A way to feel alive is to be connected to something else. And it doesn't have to be another person. I don't mean, I don't mean this in a grotesque way, but we can be connected sensually, if not sexually, to trees, to plants, to animals. We can feel this bond between us. Whether that converts into something erotic for us, I'll leave that to each of you to say. But so even if sex is out of reach, connection may not be. And the story that leaps to mind for me here on this one is a man who was a patient of mine who years ago in clinic at UCSF, and he was a famous curmudgeon. Doesn't even do it justice. I mean, people just loathed this man. It was stunning. Every time he'd come to clinic, there would be 1,000 apologies to just in his that I'd need to make in his wake. He would be rude to other people, to staff. He didn't think he was being, but that's how he came off in so many ways to so many people, etc. This man was so alone, and he kind of liked it that way. And as we got to know each other and he felt safe, he started sharing with me we talked about connection and intimacy. And he shared with me photographs he takes. And he had a habit of walking the San Francisco streets late at night, just with him and his camera, and he would take pictures of things, of people, of stuff. And the photographs were incredibly intimate. And we brought him to clinic and we were looking at them. And I realized that I was trying to sort of shore up this man who was so alone because people just didn't like him. But you know what? He was okay with that. He was finding his connection through his camera. The photographs were so gorgeous, so sensitive in ways that he didn't seem to be. otherwise. So a whole world opened up through his photography as a way to understand him, but for a way for him to feel connected to the world as a point. I guarantee you this man was not having sex in the way most of us would mean it, but he was connecting, and that was plenty for him. So each of us find our way. Don't give up this notion of sexiness, of sexuality, of sensuality, ever maybe. And here's the point here. So sex is maybe the most sort of rarefied sort of piece of this connective tissue. A little bit more accessible would be sensual, sort of feelings through the body. It may be a massage, it may just be wind, it may be a certain fabric that allows you to feel your body, that it's sensual, and that can trip into sensual, kind of heads towards a pleasure. The sensual implies physical pleasure, as sex does too. So the sensual sort of is one step removed from sex, but close. It's this physical pleasure. Sensuous is the most open-ended. Sensuous is not loaded up with good or bad or painful or pleasurable. It's just sensuous. It's just, do you feel it? Do you feel something by your senses? That's the most accessible, I would say, the least formulaic, the least narrowly defined. So I think as long as any of us has a body, I would assume that we all have rights and we all have access to some place where we get to feel sensuous and maybe even sensual, maybe even feel good through our body, maybe even feel pleasure. But let's just start with feeling something. That's plenty in some ways. That's a very powerful thing. That will remind you you have a body, that you're on this earth, that you are connected one way and another. Oh, darn it. Okay, so let's go to questions now, comments, stories. Please, again, as Sonia said, it may feel extra tricky sharing on this subject, but you're safe here. So anyone, let me stop screen sharing so I can see myself. I'm just kidding.
BJ, we did have a question come in, and I'll read it out to start us off here. Said,
Okay.
thank you so much for the discussion about being alone. I have advanced prostate cancer. I'm on ADT, and I'd love any ideas you have on ways to find a long-term partner for people with likely shortened lifespans.
Thank you for that question. It reminds me, the reason I'm smiling, because one of the things that Sonia and I had considered a few years ago, and maybe we'll circle back to it, was essentially a dating app for people who are terminally or ill or have advanced illness. Because I kept, in my clinic when I was at UCSF, one person after another would come in, and we'd talk about these issues, and invariably, not invariably, but often was, but I'm alone, I'm so alone, and who would want me? And a lot of conversations of just trying to wrap their heads around, just settle into being alone. And I kept having this, it's like, you guys, the person you just walked past in the hall is saying the exact same thing, and the person before them is saying the exact same thing. And it just feels like there needs to be some structure, some lattice work out there for people like you to find others. You are not alone, as much as it may feel that way. So it's not an answer to your question. We didn't make that app. Someday, hopefully, we will. But so chat rooms, disease-specific chat rooms, support groups can be a way to even just begin to form relationships with other people in similar shoes, and let alone, who knows if it will go to sexuality, but there's places that you might meet folks who are in similar shoes. But there are folks who aren't in your similar shoes and may still find all sorts of things to be attracted to in you and with you. So where to point you? I guess I would say, besides that, I guess my next question, or my next point, besides reaching out to sort of chat rooms, support groups, waiting rooms at the clinic, honestly, I've met a lot of people who've met in waiting rooms. Oftentimes there's such a long wait, so I wouldn't be shy there. But online can be a very powerful place too. Dating apps. If you put in your profile that you have prostate cancer, it might scare some people off, but you know what? A lot of people may be out there looking for someone just like you. So I guess I'd encourage you to try the dating apps, as brutal as those may be, and put yourself out there that way. Gird yourself. You may get a lot of rejections, who knows? And then my last note is that like we've been saying is, okay, so for a while you're alone, to the degree that you're alone, go inward, go work with what you have, work with yourself, connect to yourself. That may be erotic touch, erogenous touch, masturbation, etc., but that could also simply just be getting a massage, trying to get back into your body. Just reminding yourself that the body has all this potential to feel something, and go there. Start with the sensuous and maybe get to the sensual, and then maybe from there to the sexual. We'll see. But those are some thoughts for you. Anybody else in the group, please chime in if you have other ideas.
Yeah, we actually have someone who'd like to share on that same topic. So let
Great.
me unmute you, Jerry. And Jerry, right before I unmute you, per that last question, I believe there are some sites that are actually specific for this. So I'm going to add that into our email blast tomorrow, just to give you a link to some possibilities.
Cool.
Okay, Jerry, you may have to unmute yourself on your end, but you're unmuted on this end.
Yeah, there we go.
There you go.
Hi. So, yeah, my father is 80 years old and has survived prostate cancer. They removed his prostate prior to all this new knowledge about the waiting time, and you can just watch and wait longer with prostate cancer. And he was left impotent. And that was really challenging for him, you know, still being of a vibrant sexuality at the time in his 60s, you know, so he openly discussed this loss of it. And to me, as his daughter, it was such a gift to see my father still connecting with intimacy on a new level, growing, enhancing his life, having girlfriends. You know, he said, "Hey, it's safer sex now. My fingers do things that are a lot safer." He was just very candid and beautifully open, and kind of just more playful and spontaneous, and I don't know, it liberated him in a way that he wasn't so focused on genitalia, I guess, just to be specific, and
Yeah.
it really opened his world. Um, so that was intriguing. He has a somewhat steady girlfriend now, and they meet on Fridays and maybe Saturdays, he says, if it lingers over, if she can handle me. He's beautifully candid, delightfully open.
Wow.
It's a blessing for me to be raised in such a colorful way. Um, but yeah, there's definitely hope out there, you know, definitely ways to still connect, and maybe it's not just one partner. Like my dad said, it's a lot safer for me now. So
Uh, God, I
leave
want
with
to meet your dad, Jerry. That's awesome.
oh yeah, he's an architect, Nebraska farm boy. Really cool dude. Played rugby until he was in his 60s and has survived a lot. Has a pacemaker now and things like that. But I think also what my father would probably allude to is how healing pleasure is. Healing, you know, pleasurable touches for him. Giving still pleasurable touches to a woman was really cathartic for him, because we gain so much in giving,
Wow.
and yeah, so for him that was also a fundamental part of it. Yeah.
Beautiful. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that story about your dad. Did I cut you off, Jerry? Were you going to say something more there?
Oh, no, we're flowing, you're good.
That's so beautiful. I really appreciate you bring up so many good points. That sort of fluid nature and getting creative. And so many folks with the changes in their bodies, changes in their hormones. The question before, ADT, androgen deprivation therapy. In other words, with folks with prostate cancer, often what we're doing is taking away their testosterone, which is the chemical of sort of masculine love in some way, masculine sexuality in some way. So what happens when we take that chemical out of the body? You know, so striking this creative, but what used to turn your dad on or anybody on, you know, may no longer be the thing. But just even as you're grieving that loss, start paying attention to where you can feel good. It may be a wholly new approach to the body. And part of this body's changing means also what excites you might change, what feels good might change, and it's almost endless the amount there is to explore. If you can kind of move with it and keep up with your body in a way. It's so beautiful. that comment about ADT too. I was remembering of one of my longtime patients in clinic who since died. He was sex was very important to him, and he did not want to go on hormone therapy for exactly this reason. He wanted his testosterone, but he finally did go on ADT. And you know what? Part of what we worked on together, and he did so much of the work, was finding this new fluid creative zone. And he got in touch with his feminine side. He took out the testosterone from his body, and he came in. He carried himself differently. He dressed differently. He got into it.
Nice.
It was beautiful to see. I mean, it was just stunning, and he really rolled with it and delighted in getting to know this woman that was underneath the man. That's the probably terrible language, but that's how that's how I remember him talking about it. And anyway, so even as we're ending or closing out one chapter, doesn't mean there's not some new stuff waiting for us. Okay, who else out there? Anybody else out there?
Yeah, we've got a few more questions that have come in. I can read these out. So the next one is, how do you suggest a couple who both have disabilities find assistants who are comfortable with assisting the couple get ready for sex, but not helping during the act?
Yes, but not helping during the act?
Not helping during the act.
Okay, so sex therapy, there is a whole, psychological sort of, there's a subspecialty within psychology of sexuality, and human sexuality is a huge, huge subject across disciplinary. So there are sex therapists out there, psychotherapists who focus on intimate physical relationships. So I would we can look together, Sonia, too. Maybe there's some resources we can share, but I would just look for sex therapists. And then within the world of sex therapists, there are these things called sex surrogates. And if I may be misspeaking, there may be important details, but I believe it's a rigorous certification process. It's legitimate in all the ways that many of us might understand, where the therapist does go farther and actually begin to facilitate sexual encounters between the couple, maybe even participate. But in a therapeutic, above board way, obviously consensual, obviously with training, etc. So find sex therapists, and then also within there, maybe even look for sex surrogates who can begin to facilitate and participate if that feels right to you. So there are professionals out there for you. You just need to find them.
Okay, great. Next question that came in. This person says, as an end-of-life doula, I will sometimes work with couples where one person is in a care facility, maybe even in a shared room. I feel comfortable having conversations with the couple about how they might connect sexually, sensually, but how do I talk to the facility about the logistics of accommodating that? Do you know if facilities ever have policies or plans for that?
Great question. So I know my experience is in the hospital. I don't know if any hospital has ever worked and has an official policy per se. But we used to coach people in the hospital all the time to just simply close the door and essentially put a do not disturb sign on the door. In a hospital setting, that means telling your nurse, essentially saying, look, my partner and I are going to snuggle, whatever you want to say, and we'd like some privacy. And I'm going to can we put a note on the door, please, do not enter, please check in with nurse first. Essentially the hospital equivalent of a do not enter sign. So, and that worked beautifully. It won't work for indefinitely, and sometimes there are emergencies, et cetera, et cetera. So in a hospital facility, talking with the nurse saying, hey, we're going to snuggle, put a sign on the door and leave it at that, close the door and away you go. Now, I'm assuming in a nursing home, assisted living, independent living centers, the sort of post-acute long-term care facilities, I'm assuming the same could be possible there. It may get tricky in a nursing home setting where a lot of the rooms are not private. So if you've got roommates, well, I suppose you could talk to them directly and negotiate and say, hey, I'm wondering if my partner and I can have the room for some time while you're playing bridge or while you're out on the whatever. Would that be okay? So that might get tricky, but it would fall down less on about policy, I think, and just about good communication. And then if you really want to like close the door and no one to walk in, you want the do not disturb sign on, talk to the nurse and see if that can be arranged. You might bump into, they may say we have a policy against that for one reason or another, but gosh, I'd push on them. This is as healing stuff gets. This is not just a decadence. So you might need to advocate, and if they don't have a policy, push them to draft one and participate in writing it that would allow for some amount of private engagement. It's essential. So I hope that answers your question.
And the next question is actually very similar to what you were just speaking about. And it's, if someone is an inpatient in their own private room, what ideas do you have for staff creating an environment and an atmosphere so a husband visiting and staying with his wife feels safe and comfortable to maybe have an intimate or sexual time? What part does staff play in this?
Well, I think maybe we've largely answered that. I think staff can be your ally and can protect that privacy, essentially. Because, in a hospital, people are just popping in and out of rooms all the time, even when the door is closed. So putting a sign on the door, you need the buy-in from your nurse, et cetera, to make sure that that's cool. And then they can help protect the privacy. So maybe that's the answer to your question. If there's more to be done, drawing the curtains, turning off that horrible fluorescent light that is common in facilities. Candles are generally a no-no, but they do make these electric candles because of fire risk. They do make these little electric candles that have a sort of a glow. They're $2 at Walgreens kind of thing. So you could bring those in. It might be asking the nurse. It might be a little much asking the nurse to find such candles. But drawing the curtains, changing the lights, protecting the space, and maybe if it makes sense too, checking in on you after the partner's left. So making sure you're okay, making sure you don't need anything. That kind of just basic support. I don't think it's asking too much of your nurse. So those are some ideas. If there are others out there, let us know. I'm trying to think of what else a nurse might be called to do in such a setting. But anyway, I think that's my list for now.
Yeah. Someone also said white noise machine. That's a good one.
Oh, yeah.
I
Great.
think for this question, it's a person who works in a hospital is asking what they can do to facilitate a couple feeling like they can be intimate in the hospital.
Okay, great, beautiful. Well, you can, if you're that person's nurse, you have a lot of power. Again, like we've been talking about. If you're more at the sort of administrative level, well, I'd push your floor or the unit or the hospital to have a policy on this, to look for ways not only to say what's acceptable or not per se in the building, but actively looking for ways to facilitate intimacy. We don't have to call it sex, just intimacy. And Lord knows most of us can acknowledge, no matter what our belief system, that intimacy is important, is an important part of healing. It is an important thing to establish in a scary environment like a hospital. So you could couch this in safety and intimacy and therapeutic relationships. And again, as an admin, I would push to draft a policy that outlines that, and encourage and do an in-service with the nurses on that floor, on various floors, saying, maybe you can invite a psychotherapist in, or a sex therapist if there's one on staff, to facilitate it. But simply having an in-service on occasion about where the limits in a hospital and how you may facilitate these moments between people. Be gorgeous. So those are some thoughts for you.
Okay, we had another question come in. In an inpatient unit, how would you navigate the engagement of sex workers?
Well, I suppose there's a policy answer to this one. I would assume most hospitals would say no sex workers are allowed. I'm assuming. I have not looked. But in states where that's legal, are there states where that's legal? Yeah, Nevada. So you might be bumping up to the limits of policy and legalities here. So I don't know the answer, but I do know that if there's good relationships between staff and patient and families, most staff, especially the nurses, really want good things to happen for their patients. They'll want to help make things happen. It used to be sometimes it took the form, like back when I was in the hospital, of sneaking a beloved dog or cat into the room. There are moments like that where there's sort of a gleeful bending of the rules, situation dependent, etc. So I would start with just broaching it, I suppose, with the nurse, saying, hey, can I talk to you about something? I don't want to be reported, but I just want to feel something out here. Is this even possible? Can, whatever it is. Just noting that oftentimes there's a willingness to sort of fly under the radar and bend the rules if the relationship is in place and everyone knows what each other's up to and has best intentions, etc. So we're back to the relationship dynamic in that facility, and that's where so much of this stuff would flow. So another reason to find a way to having a good relationship with your nurse in particular.
Okay, we've had a few more come in. This person says, being married to someone with a chronic illness and chronic pain, so much of the day for years is caregiving, practical things and mental orientation to figuring out how best to care for your partner physically and emotionally, important but more of an intimate friendship. Any ideas for how to reorient when my husband suddenly feels well enough to connect physically? How to embrace being a sexual, sensual person and embrace seeing him as a sexual, sensual person?
So if I hear you right, so you guys have moved into that sort of caregiver dynamic, which can be very close, but oftentimes isn't very sexy. So if I'm hearing you right, you guys have sort of moved into that dynamic, and now the idea of sort of trying to reawaken or reopen a sexual connection. So assuming I heard you right, then I think the way to start is communication. You know, it may not feel very sexy to talk about it. I mean, you could just sort of try the organic way and just see what happens, not talking about it, but just begin touching in a certain way and check in with each other. Just feel okay. Is it safe? Are we doing all, you know, and just proceed carefully. But it may make better sense to actually talk about it, and just open it up and say, you know, hey, honey, I've been wondering if we might want to revisit this thing called sex between us. It's been a while or whatever else. And these new roles that we found ourselves in aren't so hot, and I wonder if, are you interested? Do you want to kind of, should we try to open that up together? You know, just see. And then from there, if you guys are both into the idea, at least, again, just plan for awkwardness, you know, and that can be sexy and that can be sweet. So a little clunky, and you know, a place to start would be, so talking it out, like, what do you find sexy now? Where should we start? You know, sort of trying to find the lay of the land. What's physically safe at this point? And then from there, just sort of an experimental approach, just trying things. Light touch in a non-erogenous part of the body. Start there. Just, does that feel good? Touching an elbow, stroking hair. Is that a place to start, to enter into the body? And then just check in and move from there. Move on to increasingly more intense activity or more erogenous activity, but just start with touch and check in and talk. Does it feel good? Does that not feel good? And just, you know, reorient as you go in real time. And you might, in this sort of exploratory, curious mode, you might even say out loud, honey, I'm not sure the old ways are going to work, but let's see if we can find some new ways. And that's just going to be trial and error. And sometimes it may be going to the sex shop and buying a new device, a new toy, or who knows what, a new outfit. You know, again, being open to what used to do it for you guys may not, but there may be new things. And that sort of creative checking in, clunky, moving, trying this, trying that, that worked, that didn't work. And that's kind of, in my experience, how you can kind of reconstitute as a sexual couple. And I just, again, just have a very open mind to what might constitute sexy now. That's an enormous list, generically speaking. So what works for you guys is going to be sort of a process of experimentation.
Before I head to this next question, I just want to call out something that someone put in the question area. They just said same-sex support groups can be very helpful. So that might be something that people would want to check out. The next question is, due to a botched medical procedure years ago, I have a chronic pain condition. I was alone by choice for years prior, but now I feel trapped in that space. It's hard to admit this, but I just find the thought of how could anyone want to engage with me with all this difficult needs around my physical body and pleasure. I'm also stuck in the space between pain and pleasure. How do we have a relationship with pleasure when chronic pain is so present?
Oh, there's so much to say here. I mean, this is so beautiful. Thank you, by the way, everybody, for chipping in. These are not easy things to talk about, especially vis-a-vis ourselves. So anyway, thank you. You know, I think, so for one is, it may be, especially with a botched surgery, I mean, there's not only are you living with the sort of physical fallout of that, but just the emotional, that this was a mistake, that this shouldn't have happened. This wasn't nature just doing its thing. All that is to say, this is very complicated psychologically. And so I guess before even touching sex, have you grieved well? Have you mourned what you've lost? What's that part of you that's gone now? Have you really let yourself grieve that? Have you worked through some of the anger that I would imagine comes with the botched procedure, et cetera? So kind of catching up with yourself and getting right with yourself in all these ways before even thinking about sex, maybe. Or sex could be a way to actually kind of catalyze some of those other things. I don't think there's a prescription here. But just to say, even the way into sex may be have nothing to do with sex, like grief, like mourning, like like having a safe place to emote and get a lot of stuff off your chest, etc. Looking yourself in the mirror, trying to reacquaint yourself with this new body of yours and treat it like a new body, like a newborn. So find that openness, like it's, you know, what is your body now, not what it was. So a lot of that work may be by yourself and with perhaps a psychotherapist or with someone close in. But I think once some of that work is in place, then you can more wholeheartedly turn your attention to, okay, this is the body I have now. Let's see what I can find in here. What feels good? Is it touching the elbow? Is it the toenail? Is it, you know, is it even a thought? Is it a visual image? What? Just be open to being even surprised what might turn you on. And it may be a very subtle signal. Just start with what feels good, or even start with what feels not bad. And then you can kind of go from there. So, but Sonia, would you mind rereading the question? I want to make sure I didn't miss a nuance to it.
Yeah, let's see. Where can I hit it here?
Sorry.
No problem. How could anyone want to engage with me with all this difficult needs around my physical body and pleasure? I'm stuck in the space between pain and pleasure. How do I have a relationship with pleasure when chronic pain is present?
Well, pain and pleasure. I saw a movie years ago. I can't remember. There was this, I think it was called Bob something or other, Super Masochist, and it was a really eye-opening film for me about sort of the headiness of the S&M community and how this man who had cystic fibrosis and a lot of chronic pain and all sorts of things that go with CF. And as a kid, he was in pain so much that he realized he needed to have a relationship to pain. That the idea of just wishing pain away or medicating pain away wasn't going to do the trick. But there was still too much pain in the picture. So he had to orient himself to that pain, and he began to explore what charge came with the pain. And before he knew it, he had connected erogyny to the pain. And his own exploration as in S&M world was around that, was working with his pain and flipping it. It was really stunning to see. It was a serious film. So, you know, so for you too here, is there any charge to this pain? Or is there can you kind of almost, you know, heighten the contrast between pain and the relief of pain? Might be a way to get you even more sensation going, is a sieve back and forth in and out of pain. There may be something to there for you. I don't know, but that's potential. And just the last thing I want to say here is, I know it may feel like you may feel unsexy. You may wonder that why anyone or how anyone could find you sexy. Again, if I heard your comment right. But I don't know, whoever you are, I can almost guarantee that someone out there would. It probably starts though with yourself, like we were saying. So reorient to yourself, get right with your own body, with yourself to the degree that's possible. And it's amazing to me what flows from that. When each of us sort of embodies ourselves in a certain way, we carry ourselves in a certain way, we hold ourselves in a certain way, there's perhaps a confidence or something that flows from that can be very attractive. So I've found that in my own life. When I was in the bed, you know, freshly losing 3 limbs, I wondered the same thing. Who the hell was going to want this, whatever this thing was, my body at that point, you know? And I was surprised to find that plenty of people did. And some folks ran away from it, but some folks were attracted to it. And, you know, but it took years and years of me kind of working on myself too. And I still wonder too. I mean, we can go on and on about my experience, But just to say, I almost guarantee you that someone out there would find you attractive. I think I would just start with yourself and see if you can find yourself attractive. That might be the best place to go now.
Someone found the documentary you're speaking about. It's called Sick, The Life and Death of Bob Flanagan, Super Masochist.
There you go. Thank you. Remarkable film, if I remember it correctly.
So I don't think we have any more questions that are coming in here. Unless anyone else is thinking of one. And just FYI for everyone, you know, I realize that thoughts can come up afterwards. So if you have any questions that kind of bubble to the surface after the discussion, please feel free to email us and we'll do our best to address them.
Yeah, we will. Right. We'll either email. We're trying to make more of these little videos to answer these questions so we can put them out there in ways that other people can see. Because every question any of us has, you can guarantee yourself that someone else was wondering the same thing. So don't be shy. We'll do our best to answer them to however we can. Well, so okay, guys. Unless there's any other final comments or questions or whatever else, we're almost to time anyway. I just want to thank everybody for leaning into this subject that can feel kind of goofy and weird and exciting and horrifying and all sorts of stuff. And I can't thank you enough for daring to show up and to participate in this. We should have access to our senses as long as we have a body. And as long as we can have relationships to our own body or others, we should find a way to actual sensuality and even sexuality. If we can have a big enough definition of what constitutes sexuality. And if we can't, at some point, if we have to let go of sexuality altogether as a notion for whatever reason, I'd still point you to the senses. I'd still say you have ways to connect to the world one way and another. Maybe subtle, maybe small, it may be a hair hanging by a thread kind of connection. But there's usually something out there for us until there's really not. And when there's really not, the only time I've ever seen that is really at the moment of death. But I've seen connections all the way up, happening all the way up into that moment and beyond. What am I saying? And beyond too, through grief, etc. So maybe ramping yourself into the sexual plane, maybe just what you need, a little encouragement to go there, to try, to lean into it, to find, to explore. Amen. Roll with it. And maybe some of you need to hear that it's okay to let it go, that there are other ways to connect, other ways to be in your body, other ways to feel alive, other ways to do things for their own sake. So whatever you need to hear right now, there's the range for you. And I hope some of that registered with all of you one way or another. And again, thank you guys for participating. So maybe we should say goodbye for now. All right, yeah, so I'm going to push us over to the last little slide, our last prompt. There you go. We like to end our webinars on these sort of prompts. So shoot us your answer if you're up for it. How has your idea of sex changed? That can be, you can take that question to mean just about anything. We'd love to hear, and we'd love to share your answer with others. So with that, guys, I think that is all. Have yourself a beautiful weekend, and I hope you're all enjoying spring. Perfect time to be thinking about sex. All right. Adios.